What is up, my ducks and drakes? Welcome to the Crater Lake, and today we're reading chapters 5 and 6 of Bad Moon Rising, a Sandersides fanfic by Bekka911 on Wattpad. If you'd like to check out the fic or the author himself, or themself, that sounded weird, go ahead and click the links in the description. There'll also be trigger warnings down there if you would like the trigger warning, if there are any. So with that, here is chapter 5. Tick. Deceit wasn't ready for the wall to splinter. It had been there for as long as he dared remember, keeping the worst of the darkness at bay. Because they all loved Thomas in their own twisted way. They wanted to protect him, but not shelter him. The world was crafted out of a spider web and brittle lies, but Thomas could face it. He was strong. But they built the wall because they may love Thomas, but they were the dark sides, and they weren't supposed to exist. Their work was silent and invisible and painful because they were locking away parts of themselves just so that Thomas could be okay. Deceit had been one of the first ones to start working on the wall. He knew how solid it was. Tuck. It wasn't supposed to splinter. Tick. When it shattered, something in his chest twisted sharply, and he choked on a pained gasp. A high-pitched kneeing noise erupted and spun through the air, getting louder and higher until he couldn't hear anything else. The noise went under his skin and into his veins, and it began to tear apart everything that he was. A monster was assembling in him, and he could feel the anger writhing and surging. Poison was spreading through him, and he could feel the coldness coming back to claim him again. Thomas. Tuck. The shadows would devour his host. They would rip him and tear him into pieces. And then Thomas would be rebuilt into something dark and soulless and inhumane. Deceit couldn't let him. The dark sides, they would try to stop him. They would fight him because they wouldn't want to go back. They wouldn't build the wall again. But Deceit had to. For Thomas. Tick. Except that he couldn't make his body move. Tuck. Deceit gritted his teeth and fought the spreading darkness in his veins, but it was no use. His full energy was returning to him, was burning up in his bloodstream. Soon enough, Deceit would be a monster, because it wasn't the dark Thomas should fear, it was what was in the dark that should terrify him. Because if Thomas looked into the dark, Deceit would be the one looking back. Tick. The wall, Remus said as he appeared in Deceit's room, voice slightly strained. The wall is broken. Deceit bared his teeth in a malicious grin. Yes, he agreed lowly, and delighted in the cold shiver that crept across his shoulders. And isn't it glorious? Remus's face lit up with a twisted sort of glee. Deceit's hand flexed as the dark poison finally finished chilling his veins. Oh, he'd miss this. How alive he felt. How powerful. Thomas should share in the raw rush. Tuck. The wall had been a terrible idea. Deceit met Remus's eyes, feeling something hysterical bubbling up in his chest. My dear old Duke, he purred, running his tongue over his teeth. He breathed hissed out of him. What fun we are going to have. Remus laughed, and it was wild and unrestrained and deranged, and for a moment, Deceit felt a flicker of horror at what Thomas would have to face. His host wouldn't know how to do with his sudden swell of horrific feelings, especially not if Patton was having his own negative effect. Tick. Oh well, Deceit hadn't felt this good in far too long. Tuck. The others are waiting for you, Remus said, voice suspiciously aloof. His eyes were blown wide with glee and power, and Deceit's misgivings vanished like smoke on the wind. Are you coming? I'll be there, Deceit promised, his sharp teeth gleaming. There's just something I have to do first. Remus hummed, a knowing smirk twisting in his lips. Don't keep me waiting, he purred. I'll be terribly lonely if you betray us like Virgil did. Tick. Was that a warning? Deceit nodded his head, watching with narrow eyes as the Duke faded away, cackling wildly. And yet, there had been something vulnerable about him. Perhaps Remus was feeling the strain of Virgil's absence. Perhaps the others were not as unfeeling as they claimed. Perhaps the resurgence of their full powers had awoken, and they need to be whole again. And they couldn't do that without Virgil. Tuck. So what would happen if Deceit decided he didn't want them anymore? Tick. His low laugh hung in the air as he slipped away through the shadows to check on the wall. The darkness held him tightly, slithered along his skin like cold fingers, and Deceit chuckled. We'll rise once again, he whispered to the nothingness. My old friend, we will rise. The darkness roiled in excitement, pulsing against Deceit's skin. Tuck. You have to let me go, though, my dearest darkness. There's something I must attend to before we regain control over Thomas. Tick. They allowed him to appear before the remains of the wall. Glimmering shards of willpower lay fractured on the ground, a gaping hole of nothing. Every step that Deceit took made a crunchy sound as he walked over the proof of his old heart. He'd cared once. He shuddered. What a truly awful thing. Tuck. Was that what Virgil felt when he left? The wrongness in his own skin? The sense of utter despair that choked him as he stared at the remains of one of the only good things he'd ever done? He'd built the wall to protect Thomas, and here was standing on its remains. How could he be so unaffected by it? Why was he so affected by it? Tick. Surely that internal conflict was what drove Virgil away into the arms of the Lightsides. Surely Deceit wasn't alone in his misgivings and his guilt and his disgustingly human feelings. Tuck. If the others found out, he would never escape them again. Tick. Tuck. Chapter 6. Deceit was a side of many faces. He switched between them constantly, assuming the personality of whoever he needed to just survive the moment. He'd almost turned it into a game. Who will Deceit be today? He was a woolen man made up of many woolen threads, except sometimes they tangled and he lost himself. And then the wall broke, and all of those strings inside him melted into a blob of identity, and suddenly Deceit didn't know who he was. He had a monster in his veins, and he had power in his tongue, and he had a snarl in his throat. He had a heart that was bleeding, and he had a chest that was hurting. He had a horrible sense that something was terribly wrong. Deceit was losing the game. He hated losing. A dark sort of heat threaded through his veins and warmed his wrists. It made him feel full of malice, full of anger, and full of a desperation to be better than the world. But something was still missing, something that stopped him from being whole and balanced and strong. Something was missing. Deceit bared in his teeth in frustration, his entire body cushioned by the familiar soothing darkness that clung to him. It had carried him away from the remains of the wall, had held him tightly as he tried to wade through the sudden fluctuation of power. He had it all back. It had all come back to him, and now he was hot under his skin, and he was dangerous. But he still wasn't whole. "What am I missing?" he hissed to the shadows, his voice low and sharp. "Why isn't my full power enough?" Because it isn't. It used to be. Oh, how Deceit used to flaunt his strength before the wall. But now, Deceit just felt hot and full and hollow, and it wasn't enough. He didn't understand. He hated that he didn't understand. He hated feeling stupid and small and weak. He hated not understanding the rules of his own game. It wasn't fair. "All right," he breathed, swallowing down the rising, hysteric anger that's threatening to choke him. "Take me to the others." The shadows obliged, twisting and writhing and twitching until Deceit's feet touch the solid ground and he can see. Immediately, he fixes a lazy smirk on his face and waves off the darkness with an unimpressed wave. The power in his veins surged. Deceit managed not to flinch. Remus let out a cackle. "You're late, Deceit," he said, his wild eyes a little too focused on Deceit's face. He was looking for something. Deceit wouldn't let him find it. He hummed non-comedically. "Just checking on the wall." Remus's eyes sharpened, a dark sort of vindictive glee shadowing his manic expression. He twirled his club in his hands. Deceit eyed the weapon. How the Duke could wield such a unrefined weapon made no sense. Deceit preferred elegance. Nothing about Remus was elegant. Well, Deceit didn't like Remus either, so fair was fair. "We must strike at the light sides," a voice hissed from somewhere Deceit couldn't see. "Quickly, before Thomas starts to suspect something and actively tries to restrain us." No, that was the opposite of what they needed to do. Deceit knew what it would feel like to succumb to the new power swelling in him. He knew how addictive it would be, how freeing it would help him bring Virgil back, because even Virgil couldn't resist the raw rush of dark. They could get Virgil back if Deceit would just submit. And he almost did, because he just figured out that Virgil was the thing missing. They all needed Virgil to feel whole. All of them were missing the last piece of the shadowed puzzle, and it almost hurt. Deceit wanted it. Him. Back. He wanted it, but he wanted to protect his host more. Thus, he needed to convince the others to rebuild the wall. They wouldn't like it, and he would have to fight, but Thomas couldn't fight them all and come out unscathed. If they were unleashed upon the boy's conscience, nothing would ever be okay again. Thomas would be ruined. "Give in." The power in him soothed. Something pressed against the side of his wrist. Deceit let out a measured breath. "Come on. Play. You can make it all go away. Give in." No. Deceit couldn't do that to his host. No matter how strong his yearning was for Virgil to come home, he wanted Virgil back. He needed to protect Thomas. One outweighed the other. He made up his mind. He would rebuild the wall. "Time's up, Deceit." Something murmured in Deceit's ear, and the dark side stiffened at the familiar voice. The void was back, and it was talking again, and Deceit was out of time. "You made the wrong choice, Snake. You came so close. But alas, you have failed me, and so I will take you as payment." Whoop! Deceit cut off as pure cold gripped his muscles and paralyzed him. His mouth closed with a click, and then his jaw locked. His vocal cords froze. He couldn't do anything, couldn't make any noise. All control had been stripped from him in between one breath and then the next. He tried to make eye contact with Remus, but the Duke may be uncivilized and not a friend of Deceit, but he was right there and Deceit needed help. But Remus was turning away, and then Deceit's veins warmed to the point of burning pain, and Deceit was falling. Thomas's limbs stiffened. Joan frowned as Thomas cut off halfway through his sentence, eyes glazing over and becoming fixed on something nobody else could see. Talon tried as well, their voice growing louder in their concern. But Thomas wasn't present at the moment. His throat was tight, and his eyes had become unseeing, and all Thomas knew was that something was wrong, and someone needed help. He needed help, but he couldn't make any noise, and he was falling. Virgil knew what had happened the moment his veins darkened to a sickeningly black color. Something was pushing at the edge of his mind, but he couldn't let it in. The wall had broken. Power was returning to him, but he was a light side now. And to give in to the old sense of self would force him into an internal war. No, Virgil needed to push it away. He needed to be fully light in order to win the fight that would be coming, because if the wall had broken, then the dark sides would be making a move soon, and Virgil would be the one to fight them back. Not Patton, not Logan, not Roman. It would be Virgil. There was a sharp pain in his temple, and he hissed, and then he was falling. Somewhere in the void, there was a flash of red light. "Tick-tock," a voice whispered manically. "Tick-tock." Thank you all so much for listening. If you would like to hear more, please subscribe. I could always use some subscribers. I mean, this is going to be hopefully a future career, or at least a monetary hobby. We all love those. All the links are in the description below, as well as one to my Etsy, where you could buy beaded things. I love this series so much, and once again, thank you for watching, and much like Virgil trying to hold back his urges, do your best!